This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This video follows up on our previous one in our series, The Light and the Darkness, or perhaps The Light No Darkness Can Overcome, from the Gospel of John. Last time, we talked about grief. And we talked about the way the metaphor of darkness, the problem of the world, becomes so resonant with grief through loss of people, primarily through death. And we talked about grief. I actually think as a culture, we do a decent job acknowledging grief. This video, though, is going to talk about in our culture, we do a decent job acknowledging grief over death. This video is going to talk about loss more generally. Other things that can be lost. Yes, people are lost to us, and that could be some of the hardest things we have to deal with. That's why we do acknowledge grief there. But what of other losses in our lives? Do we provide space for people to grieve and recognize what has been lost that wasn't a death? For example, loss of relationships, loss of livelihood, loss of health, loss of trust, loss of safety. These are not marginal issues in our lives. In fact, these will often constitute our deepest wounds that we have. That the relationships we had, no one died, but we've lost them. Our livelihood, the way we lived, is gone now. Our health has declined. Our ability to trust another person has been broken. Or simply our own safety and security in a variety of ways. These are losses too. Sometimes it might be more like a new space of isolation, or more directly, loneliness, which isn't really the same thing as isolation. We can be lonely even amidst other people. These things are sometimes called spaces for unacknowledged grief. Meaning there is grief here just as much as there is grief here, but we don't give it the same space in our society like we do if someone has died. And I think that's a deep mistake that we make. That when we lose these things, the wounds within them, sometimes traumas, that they are, live within us for the rest of our lives, and we process it the same way we process grief, which is, again, just like we talked about last time with grief, that grief isn't a disease that then gets cured and you're all better. So also are these losses not diseases that get cured and you're all better. The wounds we carry with us, we really do carry with us. There's actually a lovely book called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's the idea that if you do not process these traumas, they will remain in your body and they will be expressed. It's only a question of, are they going to be expressed healthfully or unhealthfully? And so we talk about losses, the losses we have, and I would put underneath all of this, maybe the biggest loss that we deal with is what I call our assumptive world. And what I mean by that is what we believe about the world we live in, that we believe that our world is consistent, reliable. We might believe that our world is safe, that we can count on it, that it's not out to get you. We might believe that the way we live is frankly natural, meaning that the reason I hold the values I hold is because that's what everybody would do if they just listened rightly to their own inner nature, as if this is the only way to live and be human. In fact, a common term for this is simply a worldview. A worldview we hold that the assumptions of what we think that the world is and from which we organize everything about ourselves can be shattered. And when this is shattered, then we have lost a tremendous asset in how we live our lives. That's where those wounds comes through. That's where those traumas come through. And if we don't acknowledge the grief that the way I thought the world was structured turns out not to be true, or at least it feels like it's not true right now. We feel like when we see that there are other ways of living, and maybe the way I thought was the only way to live, turns out it's not, and I have to deal with that crisis. That maybe I thought this world would be safe and consistent and reliable at some level, even if I didn't really think that it's not. And what does that mean? Is this simply a chaotic place? Can I handle that? What's going on? That's grief. That's loss. And to be able to acknowledge it is important. And here we come to this light that's in the darkness. The light of Christ. This metaphor of light and darkness is helpful because the light of Christ is not just that the bad things now have a good thing among them, but the metaphor of light is that which enlightens our lives so we can finally see the world as it is. And if that's going to be the case, this is what Martin Luther said the theology of the cross is that it calls evil, evil, and it calls good, good. But that means we have to recognize there is evil, and that we have to be willing to see what's going on, that the losses that are normally unacknowledged need to be acknowledged. When I was a chaplain intern, our training was, you're going to lead people through 4 stages. 1, can you notice what's happening to you? Can you name it? Then, can you recognize the emotions tied to it? And then finally, can you unpack the systems and the patterns of your life behind it? Notice what they wanted us to do as interns, meaning we didn't have a lot of training. Can you just help people notice? Can you help them acknowledge what they don't want to acknowledge? And if they can notice it, notice what's happening within their own self, their own wounds, their own traumas, then can they name it? And if they could do those things, then often the ability to name the emotions and to unpack how that affects their lives came often very easily to them. But it only could happen if you could see the world as it really is. If what we don't want to acknowledge, we finally acknowledge. And then with our hope in Christ, that we do trust in God, a God who can restore, a God who can refresh, a God who is able to take what is broken and make it whole. We have a lot of grief, and it doesn't just get better, but we can live. We can grow. And we do that through a trust in something bigger than ourselves. But we only can do it if we're willing to see what's going on. And then there will be life, a life we did not expect, something new and vibrant that can be possible once we've recognized it, to acknowledge what is usually unacknowledged. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.